The following is a test. So far, it looks like I've got the stream working, and hopefully my voice is audible. Just a few more tests and then we can get ready to get going. Right now I'm just announcing the stream on a few of the sites I frequent, and if you guys have any questions about what you'd like me to go over, I will try to go over it with the best of my ability. Hey there, man. Glad you could make it. I hope my voice is audible at least. Okay, so before I begin, is there any preference to whether I start with the M01D or the DSN-12? Yesterday I did a test stream on Picarto, and I started with the M1D, but I ended up going with the DSN-12 because someone asked about it. All right, I'll start with the DSN-12. A lot of people get a little confused with its weird interface, but once you get the basic flow down, it's not very difficult. The main difficult aspect of the program is the building of your own synths, which is outside the scope of what I'll be doing today. I'm still preparing more advanced tutorials with a partner for the YouTube channel in general, but I will walk through how you basically use the DSN-12. And after I'm done with doing that, I'm going to go over the M1D if I get requests for that too. All right, so I'm going to test my whiteboard software real quick just to make sure you guys can see what I'm writing on the screen when I highlight different areas, uh, just to be able to tell you the names of things. Are each of these marks I made visible? Okay, so I'm going to start from the beginning of how to work with the DSN-12. We're going to go through and get a basic feel for everything that you can do in the app. Oh man, can you hear me now? Testing. Testing. Is it still silent? I really hope not. I turned the marks off. Yo, Quinn? Okay, I'm glad the audio's back at least. Alright, so this is going to be a quick walkthrough. We'll start from the beginning. Here's how you make a blank song in the DSN-12. When you start up the program, you'll be presented with this screen where you can load, make a new file, open a demo, or delete files. Unfortunately, unlike the M01D, you cannot share any of your music online with the DSN-12. Hopefully they address that in a new update. I'm not sure. So we're going to start from the beginning with a new song. When you start a new song, you're presented with this. This is your main screen. And from your main screen, you can make 4 banks of 16 patterns. So each of these vertical columns are patterns. By default, you'll have a pattern with just a basic kick pattern. And the thing that gets confusing about this program is how do I arrange this into songs? So let's make something real quick. I want to focus first on this bar at the bottom. This bar, I don't know its name just yet, which is why I'm doing these streams, but this is where you'll be doing most of the editing of your patterns in this mode. The first 2 buttons here are for sequence and tone. So say I want to copy what's in here. If I only have sequence copied and I make a duplicate of this pattern, you're going to hear the default settings on each of these tracks. That's not going to sound any different right now because I haven't changed anything yet. So I'm going to go ahead and select erase and erase. So let's make something real quick. I want to first change the instrument that I'm going to be working with. So I'm going to select tone and deselect sequence. And then I'm going to select track 7. Now I still had erase select, so it asked me if I wanted to erase. And because I have tone selected, I erased whatever data was in there to begin with. So I'm going to want to make sure I have select picked, and then I click the track number that I want to deal with. This is the tone window. And it's got a lot of information about what the synths you're working with are. I'm not going to deal with that at the moment. What I'm going to do instead is open an instrument I've already made. I'm going to go to tone, and then I'm going to go to import. The DSN-12 has a new feature now that allows you to import instruments that you have saved into other songs. So if you make a really nice instrument that you like, you can bring it into any new songs without having to go and look in a bunch of notes and try to get all the little knobs to be where you need them to be again. So I'm going to import this kick drum that I like from a song that I've already written. And in fact, I'm going to import some other percussion instruments from the same song. We'll start with a kick, a clap, and a bass. Okay, so now I'm going to press the sequence button and make sure select is picked so I can start inputting notes into these tracks. What I just did was switch between two open tracks with the D-pad. That's a subtle thing that you may not have noticed, but pay attention to this right here. Tells you where you are in your song in the upper screen. So if you pay attention, you can see that's changing as I'm pressing up and down on the D-pad. So by default, your tracks will have 16 steps and you'll have 12 of them available to you. You layer each of these tracks on top of one another to create a full pattern. You can press on the keys in the piano roll to audition the different notes so you can really get a feel for what you're trying to do. The DSN-12 treats notes a little differently than other sequences that you may be used to. Each of these notes is a standalone note, and if you have two of them next to one another, it'll sound them both with no portamento between them until you tell it to do so. So if I want these notes to be longer, I have to go into my gating settings. Right now we have each of these notes set to 75%. That means that each of these notes will take 75% of a full note. Think of notes in the DSN-12 as having a beginning, a middle, and an ending. If you have two notes here, you want one to be legato and one to end at 75, 100, anything but legato. Because what legato tells the software to do is blend the next note into the previous note. See you later, Quinn. Thanks for coming. So if you listen carefully, you can hear the notes slide into one another because they're both set to legato. So let's move on to the chaos pad while this pattern is playing. This is the chaos pad. It's an XY based controller. I'll show you what that means. When you drag across this pad, the changes will be made based on your position on this pad. So So this means that as I drag left and right, the notes go higher and lower, and as I drag up and down, the gating changes from so as I drag up and down, it'll go from 25, 50, 75, 100, and legato. The chaos pad is really great for automation. That's basically what you'd use it for. You can use it during performance, live performance, for improvisation. Personally, I'm not a performer, so I use it to help me with automating different aspects of the sound I want to edit. Take note of this section down here. This section is the legend. It tells you what the X and the Y are set to right now. Oh, the reason the audio is cutting out is because I'm using push to talk, and it's difficult for me to draw and to talk at the same time. So this legend area right here that tells you what X and Y are bound to can be edited. So if I go and click this area right here, it gets me to settings. Now the first chaos pad bank is only going to allow me to change the key, the scale, and the note range. And that's because the first one is always for inputting notes. All right, I'll go back to the chaos pad explanation. So the chaos pad is for automation, and as you go up and down, you are changing the gating in the first bank, and as you go left to right, you are changing what notes are playing. Likewise, as you go from left to right, you are increasing the pitch of the notes you're working with. So that means if I put my stylus up here in this corner, I will be playing notes that are both as high as my range will allow, and they will all blend into each other because they'll all be set to legato. So if I want to keep all my notes legato, I can drag back and forth at the upper part of the chaos pad. Now, as I was talking about before, the legend at the bottom will allow me to change settings for the chaos pad. So I'm going to go in and change what I'm bound to when I drag back and forth. So right now, by default, you are dragging back and forth with notes that are in the Ionian scale, in the key of C, with 2 octaves of note range between them. So that means the range from the far left to the far right is 1 octave, or rather it's 2 octaves, and it's in the key of C and it's in the Ionian scale. So you can decide which key you'd prefer, like maybe D sharp, and maybe I want it to be minor blues, and maybe I don't want as much range, so I'll have it stick in 1 octave. And let's hear what we get. I'm dragging at the upper part of the chaos pad to get these sounds. If I drag towards the bottom, the notes will sound choppier because the gating is much lower. So let's move on to the other banks that are available. You switch between banks up here. These 3 buttons are how you switch between the different banks available. The second bank is always for panning and volume. So you can use that to automate the panning and volume of the notes that you've already written. Or you can first go into the first bank, do some improvisation with the chaos pad, and then pan it back and forth and change the volume. So just as we described before, the legend down here tells us what the X and the Y parameters do. So up and down is set to volume. And left and right is set to panning. So if I play what I have right now, it sounds normal, but if I drag back and forth on the chaos pad, I can change the panning. And likewise, if I drag up and down, I can change the volume. So you can use this for things like sweeping effects and really anything you can think of. Now, anything that you change in the chaos pad can also be changed in a sequencer window, like I showed you before with the gating sequencer. Now, the second bank is not changeable. it is always panning and volume. So you can't change anything here. The third one, however, is where you'd go to make any other kinds of changes that you'd want, any other parameters that you'd like to automate. Let's take a look at that. Okay, so right now, our X and our Y are set to cutoff and peak. I haven't really talked about what those parameters mean just yet, and I probably won't get into too much detail about them during this stream, but I will at least let you listen to what that sounds like, and then we can move on to how to deal with arranging music in this program. So this is the bank that we can customize. We can change what parameters we want to automate here. So just to go over it, this is set to peak. And this is set to cutoff. You can make all sorts of interesting effects messing around with just these settings. So I know a lot of people like to use this to make like a funk wah guitar kind of sound and other sweeping effects. It's really worth going in here and experimenting to see what you can get going. Also remember, you can go in and sequence any of these changes so you can have them work exactly the way you want them to, and it doesn't have to be this kind of performance sort of feel to it. So what I'm doing here, I'm dragging from here to here, and I'm getting that kind of sound. But because I haven't pressed record yet, none of this information is saved at all. So if I want to record this performance, I need to press the record button. When you press record, it'll automatically play. So it's waiting for you to keep trying to input the notes you want. So we can hear what that did. Let's go see what it did. We're going to go back into our synth settings, and we're going to go into our sequencer, and then we're going to go and look at these buttons at the top. These are all those parameters that we were able to deal with our chaos pad. These first two are notes and gates, so that's bank 1. The second two are velocity and panning. And this third one those are X and Y parameters that we can customize. So right now, my X is set to cutoff and my Y is set to peak. So let's go take a look at what that automation I recorded did. So we can take a look here and we can see on this chart a sequence showing what automation we just recorded. You'll come to really understand what you're looking at here after practicing with it for a while, but just be aware that you can change and fine-tune any of these whenever you want. And you don't even have to go into the chaos pad to actually record this data, but you do have to go in there if you want to change what parameters you're going to be customizing. So let's go back to our chaos pad real quick. And say I don't want it to automate the cutoff and the peak. I want to do something else. By the way, if what I'm talking about is at all confusing or you'd like me to stop and go over something, that's fine. I'm here to give you guys basic working knowledge of this app and the M01D as well. So feel free to ask any questions that come to mind. So these are all the different parameters that we can go in and automate. Now, if you'll take a look at all this stuff, I'll let you know that all that stuff corresponds to each of these different knobs and tubes. You can automate any of these. Anything that has a knob on it, you can automate it. So like this VCF cutoff right here. That is what we're automating by default. The cutoff and the peak are these two values. So I'll play it, and you see how these knobs are going back and forth? That's because of the automation that we did back with the chaos pad. Okay, so far so good. What we've learned so far is how to manipulate each of these little sequences in each of these patterns. So just so we're clear on the different terms that I'm using, each of these is a pattern. Well, each of these is a sequence actually. So we'll call these a sequence. Now, this vertical section, this is a pattern. Oh, that's good to know. Thank you for letting me know that. This stream is actually the first test of streaming this on YouTube, so I'm going to have to take a look at what I can do about any latency that comes up. So the little white boxes, we'll call them sequences. The vertical bars we'll call patterns. These rows, they're called tracks. So you have, well, we'll explain one more thing. This section at the bottom, these are called banks. You can think of a bank as a storage box that contains more of whatever it is you're working on. So each of these are pattern banks. We have 16 patterns per bank. So right now I'm in bank A on pattern 1. But you can click on these different banks to see what you've got in each of these patterns. So you have 4 sets of 16 patterns available to you with 12 tracks each. That's a lot to work with. And I haven't even gotten into changing the number of steps you have in each sequence. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back into sequences and look at what we've got going. Okay, so as we can see from the upper screen, right now I'm in track 6. That track is called Rex Base, and it has 16 steps available. So we'll go in and take a look at what that means. So we can see up here, each of these is the count of steps. So step 1, 2, 3, 4. And when we have 16 steps, that's saying that in a sequence, we're allowed to have 16 steps worth of notes. The KORG DSN-12 is monophonic. That means that in each pattern, you can only have one note per step. So see how I have C4 in each of these steps, 3 and 4, 7 and 8, 11 and 12, 15 and 16? If I wanted to layer these notes on top of each other, like say I wanted C and maybe G on top of each other, I can't do that. If I push down on G, it'll move the note there. That's what monophonic means. And that's important to know. That's why there are so many tracks available, 12 compared to the M01D's 8 tracks that are available. The M01D is polyphonic. That means that if I wanted to layer notes on top of one another, I could do that. I could layer as many as I want up until a point, because the M01D will start cutting different sounds out if you layer them too hard, but it won't stop you from doing it in the first place. Okay, so before I continue, I want to explain what's happening on the top screen a little more. So we already see the track name and the track number, the step count. Now, over here, we have what pattern number we're on. We're in Bank A, pattern number 1, just as I explained before. This is the current time that's playing. So if I play this pattern, you'll see that number change. So as we can see, this last number is changing, and that number corresponds to what step number you're on. Now that I've changed patterns, the second number has changed. That is saying what pattern we're on. Now that I've selected another pattern in another bank, the letter has changed. So the letter is what bank I'm in. The first number is what pattern number I'm on, and the third number is what step I'm on. So you can use that to keep track of where you are while you're playing your song. That becomes useful if you are, say, recording and you want the recording to loop. So I'm going to make a few more instruments just so we can test the next few things that I want to explain. I want to encourage anybody watching, if you already have the apps, to follow along with me. That will make things a lot easier for you to remember. And if you don't have the apps, go on and get them. They're on sale right now, half off. Go for it. So when you're going and making new instruments, you can audition the instruments that you're working on by pressing B from the tone window. So if you press the B button, it'll make that sound. One of the important things about the DSN-12 is this oscilloscope. That's what you're seeing up here. That is showing you what the instrument you're making looks like, or what its waveform looks like. So this is a saw wave. And if I go around and mess with these VCO settings, voltage controlled oscillators, I can change the character of the sound I'm working with. So here we have a saw wave. Here we have a triangle wave. Here we have a pulse wave. Here we have a noise wave. You have two oscillators that you can combine to make whatever sounds you're trying to make. I'm not going to go very detailed into synthesis because that's outside of the scope of this stream, but I did want to get you up and running so you can at least know what you're looking at. So right now, you only hear the first oscillator, and that is because of this balance knob right here. The balance is between the sound of the first oscillator and the second oscillator. So I can change this second one to whatever right now, and you don't hear any kind of change. Oh, I accidentally touched the cutoff. Okay. So let's first change this balance to see what it sounds like to have two of these different triangle waves on top of one another. I'm going to move it to about the middle. Now, for the future, when I describe these knobs, I'm going to describe them in terms of the 12-hour clock. So this position that the balance is in now is 12 o'clock. I'm doing that because there is no numerical output that shows us what it is we're doing. So we need an approximation. So when I mess with these knobs, I want you to pay attention to the oscilloscope up here. So this is what it sounds like as is. See, that's the sound of these two oscillators on top of one another. They're both the same kind of wave, but they are slightly offset in pitch. And that change is happening here. You see how it's not quite at 12 o'clock? That means that the second oscillator is slightly detuned. So if I had this at 12 o'clock, it would be exactly the same two pitches on top of one another, with 50% balance between each of them. So they both are getting equal priority and they both sound the same. But if I detune it just a bit, it sounds a little different. Now the problem with dealing with the pitch here and working with pitch in general is you can really get the instrument out of tune, but sometimes you want that. It's up to you to really dig into that and see where you're going to go with it. See how out of tune that can get? And if you drag it all the way to one end or another, that's an entire octave of difference between these two oscillators. Okay, so if I decided to take the balance all the way over to 2, then you'd only be hearing that triangle wave. So you can change up the balance how you want. Now when we start getting into patching and all that kind of stuff, these settings kind of affect each other differently, but we're going to stay away from that for the moment. Let's just make something that I can use real quick. Alright, that sounds pretty alright so far. Now I'm going to deal with filtering. VCF stands for voltage controlled filter. And you start with an oscillator, that's what generates your sound, and then you filter elements out of the sound to get your final sound. So let's turn the cutoff down a little. You'll remember from earlier that we messed with the cutoff setting in the chaos pad. So you can automate any of this stuff and have it change over time. Let's hear what that sounds like. I'm going to drag this cutoff value while I audition it so you can hear the difference. You see how the oscilloscope is slowly showing nothing when I drag the cutoff down to nothing? That's because what a filter does is it filters out elements of the sound. So the lower your cutoff, the lower amount of the sound the filter is allowing to come through. Okay, so I'm going to go over this last section before I start composing some more, just to give you a feel for what this is. This last section over here, EG, that is for your attack, decay, sustain, and release envelope. And what that means is, so when we have sound, we can change what parts of the sound come in and leave with these knobs. So attack refers to what is happening right when you first hit the sound. So when I press B, the attack is instant because it's set to 0. The higher your attack time, the longer it'll take for the sound to start up. So I'll turn the attack all the way up. Right now I'm holding the B button, and you can't hear anything. I'm still holding it. Look how long that's taking to start up. That's what it means to have a very slow attack. That's what you call that when this knob is all the way up. Your attack is slow. It's taking a very long time to get started. Still going. I'm still holding the B button. And when I let go, it instantly goes to 0 because the release is set to 0. So I'm going to turn the attack way back down. Let's make it not instant, but a little slow. So there's a little bit of startup to that. Let's turn this up a little more. You hear how it fades in? You can think of attack as fade in, if that helps you to remember. Okay. So now we're going to go to decay. I'm turning my attack back down to 0 so you can hear the difference. Okay, so while attack was how long it takes for you to get from no volume to the maximum volume you're going, decay is how long it takes to get down from the maximum volume back down to your sustained volume. I'll go back over decay in a moment because sometimes that one's a little difficult for people to understand. But I will tell you that turning your sustain down to 0 And messing with your decay is a good way to have very short, kind of plucky notes. Sustain is just the maximum volume that your note will be while it's playing. So my sustain is down at 0, so the volume just starts decaying as soon as I let go. As for release, release is how long it takes from the time you stop pressing on the button or the note stops sounding to nothing. Actually, all the KORG DS apps have chaos pads. They just work slightly differently. Well, they work slightly differently because of the different contexts. Like the M01D is not a synthesis program. It is a sampler. So you can use the chaos pad to automate notes, but you can't use it to automate any kind of oscillations or anything like that in the M01D. But yeah, the chaos pad's right there in all of them. Alright, so I'm going to go over these other settings real quick. So this area controls the pitch of the instrument you're working with. So if you mess with the first knob, you turn it towards the left to make your starting pitch lower. Or turn it to the right to make it higher. This changes the pitch of middle C. For the DSN-12, that's C4. By default, it's at 12 o'clock. The second knob, portamento, is how the notes blend into each other when you play them. So by default, portamento is set to nothing, and each note has a distinct separation from one another. So let me turn my sustain up a little. So each note has a distinct separation from one another when there's no portamento. But as you turn the portamento up, notes blend into each other, which is hard to tell when you're just auditioning it, so we'll do some sequencing. I'll turn portamento down so you can hear the difference first. So right now there's no porto. As I turn it up, the notes blend into each other. They slide from one to the next. The higher your portamento, the stranger the effects you can get, but you can use that to your advantage. Sometimes a little portamento sounds nice, depending on the instrument you're working on. Yes, that visualizer up there tells you what your instrument is looking like. It's extremely useful. So, for instance, let's look in this lab. That is the voltage controlled amplifier, and that changes the volume of the sound. So take a look at the oscilloscope up there as I change the level. And then as I change the drive. You see how that waveform changes? When you start learning about synthesis, you learn to recognize these different waveforms. So I know that this is something that's been cut off because it looks more like a sine wave. If I turn the cutoff back down, notice how the wave gets more ragged. The oscilloscope is actually very useful for building synths. Back in the DS10, DS10 Plus days, we didn't have this, so we had to basically play by ear and listen to what's going on. Oh no, is it still frozen? About how far back were you running into issues? Alright, so I'm going to adjust these knobs while the oscillator goes up again, just so you can get a look at that. Okay, so we're going to start with the voltage controlled amplifier that I have circled right now. As I change the level and drive, the waveform up there will change. Okay, so you can also change how the notes go through, like what happens with the notes when they sound. So right now I have it set to EG, which means that as the notes sound, it will be looking here to see what to do about the volume. If I switch it to gate, what it'll do instead is play a note until there's no gate for it, or until the gate turns it off. So you see how this diagram shows a kind of smooth fade and bump instead. So if I play this with it set to gate, it'll play each note for exactly as long as it appears in the sequencer. So it's just playing, ending, playing, ending, playing, ending. We'll go right back into keeping our ADSR settings. By the way, this EG, you'll also hear that referred to as A, D, you'll also hear it referred to as ADSR for attack, decay, sustain, and release. Okay, so that's a basic rundown of the synth section. We're not going to deal with patching or anything like that today. But what I will do is get rid of what I just wrote there because it does not fit in at all. Now, if I press play, right now I don't hear anything at all. If this happens, don't panic. What's probably going on is one of your tracks is set to solo. So we can fix that by going into the mixer. That's this button here from the main screen. So we can take a look down here to see what we have soloed and what we have muted. Okay, this is a test. All right, so these settings at the bottom are your muting and your soloing settings. So when you press solo, it'll only play that track. So right now it's playing and we don't hear anything because it's soloed to a track that has no information on it. If I press solo, it'll toggle the solo and we'll be able to hear again. Soloing is very useful for when you want to isolate individual tracks and just listen to it and make changes. So we can solo a track from the mixer, and we can also solo a track from inside of the track while we're sequencing it. We can press this solo button here, and we'll only hear the track that we have soloed. You can set more than one track to solo. Likewise, you can set any track to mute if you don't want to hear that track and you want to hear everything else. So let's save real quick. It's set to initial song because I haven't saved this yet and I haven't given it a title. So I'm going to press save as, which is what you need to do if you want to give the song a title. And I'm just going to call it tutorial 2. And press enter. And that's how you save. The process for saving works a little differently in the M01D, and it also works a little differently in the previous DSN or the DS series. But in the DSN-12, it'll save a new file after you've given it a name, and you don't have to go select what position it's in. It's convenient. So we're going to load a song that I wrote for yesterday's tutorial just to get a look at that. Okay, so here we have fully arranged tracks in patterns, and now we want to know, how do we arrange this into a song? Test. Okay, so when you want to arrange patterns you've already made into a song, you need to go into the pattern program mode. We start here by going into this pattern mode, and then from there, we press pattern program mode. But before we go there, I'm going to show you what this screen is. These are pads that you can use for live performance when you have already written patterns for them. So if I touch any of these pads, it'll play the pattern that's at that location. Just like we had before, we have our 4 banks of 16 patterns. So in bank A, we have 16 patterns, bank B, 16 patterns, and so on. And touching any of these will play that pattern. One thing of note is this lock button. That will let you know, or that will control whether or not the DSN-12 will let a pattern play to the end before it switches to the next one. So if I turn lock off, it will immediately switch to each new pattern while I'm playing. I like to keep lock on because I'm not a performer, I'm a composer, and I need things to be able to loop. So it's very convenient to have lock on and to be able to switch from the last pattern to the first pattern and get a good loop point. Okay, testing. Now we're in the pattern program mode, and you can see that I've arranged these patterns into a song. So if I press play, it'll play the patterns in the order I've told it to. You can also mute individual tracks while you play the different programs you've created. So if we go into this mute mode, we can mute any individual track at any point in the sequence of our song. So each of these little boxes corresponds to a mute point, meaning for this section that I have track number 1 muted, you can't hear track number 1 play at all. So I'll play it. You don't hear track 1 there. But if I remove those, track 1 will play. You can use that to extend the amount of song you can write with the patterns you're constrained to, but you actually have a lot of room to work with the DSN-12. Before I continue, are there any other questions that you have that you'd like me to address specifically at the moment? If there are no further questions, then I will move on to the M01D. Otherwise, any questions about the DSN-12, the interface of the DSN-12, I will walk you through those. There's not a whole lot else to this program. Well, that's a little inaccurate. There's a lot to this program, but there's not a whole lot to the interface. You can import different instruments from other songs you've written. You can arrange patterns You can arrange sequences into patterns, which you arrange into songs. You can individually mute different patterns. That's really all there is to making music in this app. The rest is just learning synthesis. And that is one of the excellent things about this app. You can really use the DSN-12 to dive into synthesis in a way that I find kind of easier to deal with than a lot of the other solutions out there. It's portable, you have it right in your pocket, so you can practice and mess around in a low impact environment whenever you want. It's nice. So I'm going to go and move on to the M01D. But before I do that, I'm going to take a brief intermission to announce this on more places. Thanks for watching. So from what you've seen so far, do you think that you'd be interested in this app? Oh, before I move on to the next app, I will go back to the mixer because I didn't explain any of the stuff you could do in the mixer at all. So let's go in this mixer, and you'll see these three boxes at the top. At the top of each track, you'll see each of these three boxes. These are your FX panels. I think that if you're a beginner, you'd probably be better off with the M01D. It depends on what it is you're trying to learn. I think that either of them, the M01D or the DSN-12, are excellent to start with. But I would favor the M01D for a beginner, if only because you don't have to concern yourself with actually making the instruments. The M01D has a bank of instruments, 342 deep, that you can choose from. So maybe you want to stick with the M01D. And I'll walk you through the M01D right now, just to show you the difference between them. I mean, there's kind of a lot to juggle with the DSN-12, but I will show you the FX tracks because these are things that are available in both programs. So you can apply effects to any of the tracks that you're dealing with. In the DSN-12, you have 3 effects available. In the M01D, you have 1 that you can choose from that you can apply to different tracks. The difference between the two programs, the M01D is a little less flexible in terms of editing the individual rudiments of the sound you're working with, but it's a lot more flexible when it comes to actually writing in your music. So it's a lot more forgiving. It's polyphonic as opposed to monophonic, meaning you can input notes on top of one another, you can learn about chords, you can learn about any of that kind of stuff. And for my students at my job, I recommend the M01D, and that's what I recommend anybody starts with. They're both a lot of fun though, and you can get some really excellent music out of them. The DSN-12 represents quite a bit of potential. Yeah, it's great. So here we have a track that has effects applied to it. Let's hear what this sounds like when I take the effects away. It sounds really plain. So I'll explain what these 3 effects tracks are. This first box is for reverb. Reverb is like echo. So let's go into the FX section and see what we've got. Yes, they are complementary apps to one another. I use them both. I'm using the DSN-12 to learn synthesis. No, absolutely. It would be great to get both. It's not stupid at all. See, the thing is, they both engage different aspects of making music. The DSN-12 is good for learning synthesis. That is, how do I create and design sound? The M01D is good for composition. How do I create music? How do I arrange sounds that I've got into a pleasing composition? How do I learn to arrange the sounds from instrument to instrument? And you can learn different tricks that carry into both of them. They're excellent partner apps. By the way, I'll be making more comprehensive tutorials on this YouTube channel going forward. And I'll also be working on more comprehensive tutorials and guides for the DSN-12 and the M01D on Tumblr on learn3dsmusic.tumblr.com or learn3dsmusic.com. We're still running a crowdfunding campaign to be able to pay for everything. Okay, so let's mess with the reverb a bit. Right now I have the reverb just set to room. Hey, anytime. I know it can be a little difficult to know which one to get from the limited information that they give on the eShop and, the limited information available on the apps to begin with. So, anytime. So, the reverb, you can change what size the room you're in is. So what this is simulating is when you play sound in a room of different size, you get a different effect. Hey, thanks. So you have 5 different kinds of reverb, the last one being a simple delay. You can have a delay on any of these effects tracks, but reverb only lets you have different reverbs. So that is different kinds of echo, for an easy way to explain that. I want to encourage you to really go in and mess around, experiment, see what you like the sound of. That's a very good way to discover what you can do with these apps and what you can do with sound in general. There's a wide world of possibility out there, so go for it. So I've turned on these other effects tracks, and it's sounding different than it did before. Let's take a look at these different effects and get a basic explanation of them. This is a compressor. The best way to explain that is that it is taking the sound that is playing and making it more intense. That is not the scientific way to describe what's happening, but for our purposes, just think of it doing that. The compressor will make the sound more intense. We've already explained delay, but here's a tip. When you're working in sequencers like this, you can make a fake delay. So let's go explain that right now. So we're back in our sequencer. There's delay on that. You see up here, you see what it's doing. That's why this oscilloscope is good, because you can start to understand different audio concepts by seeing what's happening while it's happening. See that? And that's the same instrument, but with no delay, no echo on it. See how we see the waveform and then it stops? So here's what echo is doing. Let's go into our volume settings and so pay attention to the waveform up there. You saw how it's doing what it was doing when the echo was on. It's starting loud and then getting softer. That's what an echo is. So you can fake that. You can do that in both the DSN-12 and the M01D. You can do that in any software that allows you to change the volume on a per note basis. That's good to know because what the DSN-12 is all about is about economy of sound design. So that means you want to get all kinds of effects and different sounds going on in your song, but you only have 3 different effects tracks available to you. You only have 12 instrument tracks available to you. You have 4 banks of 16 patterns available to you. How do you squeeze that and get the most out of it? That's for you to experiment with. So if you make the echo manually, you don't have to use an effects track for echo. That way you can use that effects track for something else and get a neat effect out of it. I'm going to open another one of these just to see if I have anything available that shows any other tricks. And then we're going to move on to the M01D. And I will show you how that one works. That's about all there is to worry about when you're dealing with this app. The more advanced things involve taking a look at your oscilloscope to really fine-tune your sound. But it's good to be well versed with the interface, to know what this means, to know how to switch the number of steps you have available. We'll do that right now just to make sure. We'd go under the settings button to be able to do that. What we have listed here is the tempo of the song, that is how fast it's going. That's 160 beats per minute. That's what BPM stands for. You have the master step. So why you see master BPM, master step, and BPM and step is because you can change on a per pattern basis how fast and how long each pattern is. So right now my master tempo is 160 beats per minute, and there are 64 steps in each of these patterns. So let's take a look at that. So you see how we see 16 steps at a time. So where's the rest of the 64? These buttons up here are how you navigate your piano roll. At least in the DSN-12. It works a little differently in the M01D, which we'll get to. If you press these buttons, you can go back and forth and up and down throughout the step sequencer. So as you can see, because there are 64 steps, there are 4 screens of this piano roll. But if I wanted an individual pattern to have a different number of steps or to go faster, I can go into this settings button and change it on an individual basis. So just as we said before, we have 4 banks of 16 patterns. So right now, remember how I explained how to navigate with this section up here? We know we're in bank A, we're in pattern number 1, and we're on step 1 right now. So if I wanted to change that, I'd make sure I'm in bank A, pattern number 1, and then I can change the tempo and the number of steps. So you can't make the steps count any higher than 64, but you can make it less. So what if I wanted this to be only 16 steps? I only want the first part of this pattern. Let's hear what that sounds like. We only hear the first part. But we can't really tell that with all these different instruments muted. So we'll go back into the mixer and remove the solo toggle on all of them. So we can hear that it just cuts off immediately because we only have 16 steps available. Now that doesn't delete the steps that you have written already. Let's go in and look at that. That is good to know. Take a look up here and notice that these 16 steps are lit. But if we go further than that, the notes are still there, but they're not lit. That's how you know that, these notes aren't active, but they're still there. And here we can see the difference. All these are lit, so they're all active. So that's something worth paying attention to. And likewise, you can go into your settings and individually change the tempo. So let's say I want the tempo to be slower for whatever reason. If I play this first pattern, it'll be slower and it'll only play the first 16 steps. And I can go in and mess around with that. Okay, so you'll notice this button just showed up. That's for clearing any custom settings you have here, which is a nice addition to the program. The M01D did not have this. So if you began dealing with custom steps and such in the M01D, there was no button to clear those settings. So it would often be inconvenient. So let me clear this. And there we go. So now it's like we didn't mess with that at all. Okay, that's about everything. We're going to move on to the M1D now. Any questions? The digital manuals are not great. Actually, one of the things I'm working on for Learn 3DS Music is transcribing the digital manuals because KORG has made them available in their bitmap formats, but they're just pictures of the 3DS manuals, and it's really inconvenient to deal with them. So I'll be preparing those manuals and uploading them on the Tumblr, which will be located at learn3dsmusic.com. Yeah, they both have manuals. They're a little poorly translated as well, which I will be working on fixing up, but they are available in the apps themselves, so you can thumb through that at your convenience. I'm glad to do it. They the director of the app actually was one of the first backers of the fundraiser. He was pretty excited about it. Right now I'm working on spreading the word and getting the gaming press to pay attention because these apps are available and they're very powerful and everyone can benefit from them, but it's just intimidating and the documentation isn't great and there isn't much of a English speaking community for them yet. So I'm doing what I can to help build that. I'm glad to hear that. I would love it if more people picked these apps up. I mean, the M1D, when that came out, it was so exciting, but almost no one knew what it was, and trying to explain it was difficult. And there were no video tutorials or anything that could help somebody get into it. So I decided to put my expertise towards it and make that happen. Yeah, that's definitely true. The thing that made me end up getting into them, I believe someone I knew either had a copy or I got to try it somewhere, but it's definitely one of those things that is difficult to get into unless you have an idea of what it even is. Okay, so this is the KORG M01D. It is my personal favorite app on the 3DS. I adore this app. I make music in it all the time. I use it to make music for my video games, and I use it to teach my students how to get into composition. Let's jump right in. When you start the M1D, you always start at this screen, and you go to play to select what you're going to do. Unlike the DSN-12, everything is arranged a little bit differently. You have 4 demo songs that you have available to you at all times, and well, actually 5. You have 5 demo songs and an initialization package that's available to you. Whenever you want to start from scratch, you'd select init, and then you'd press yes to load that song. The M1D only allows you to save up to 300 or so songs. So once you have saved that many, it won't allow you to save any new ones. Yeah, they're a lot of fun. I say go for it. Okay, so here's the main screen in KORG M1D. Just as before, we have a selection of tracks, and a selection of sequences, and a selection of patterns. Let's define all those things from the beginning. Okay, so each of these green squares is a sequence. Each of these columns is a pattern. Now, the M1D refers to these as scenes, which is a strange quirk of the way it's designed, but most other digital audio workstations will refer to that as a pattern. This refers to it as a scene. It's the same concept. These are tracks. You have 8 of them available to you when you work in the M1D. Tracks can be thought of as instruments. So the important difference between the M1D and the DSN-12 is this command bar here. These buttons are context sensitive and they're always up there. You can tell what they do by looking at the upper screen. So this first button is your selection operation. While you have that set, you can press on each of these sequences and move them around, left to right or up and down. If you press that button again, selection becomes copy. You're switching modes. Instead of moving a pattern back and forth or a sequence back and forth, you copy it. So if I drag it to the right, I've copied it to the right. If I don't want that there, let's press the copy button again, and now it's set to erase. Anything I tap will be erased if I confirm it to be so. You can also press insert to insert an empty space in between different patterns, different sequences, or any of that. So I've been moving sequences around up until now, but you can also move patterns. If I have it set on insert mode and press the pattern up here, it does an insertion for all of the tracks in that pattern. So let's switch it to delete and get rid of that. Same as selection, we can move entire patterns around. So you'll notice that that loops through these different modes: selection mode, copy mode, erase mode, insert mode, and deletion mode. That's all that button does for this screen, and in some of the other screens it goes through a similar cycle. Now the second button is settings, so let's press that. Just like we were dealing with in the DSN-12, we have a settings screen, but it's a lot simpler than what we had before. We can still change the tempo and the step counts for individual patterns, and we can still change the master tempo and the master step count, but now we have some settings that we didn't have in the other program. Swing, I'll get into what that is a little later, but know that the minimum amount is 50. That's also the default amount. And scene lock is the same as the lock button in the DSN-12. I'll show you just an example of that. But that's why it's important that I let you know that patterns are called scenes in the M01D. Otherwise, you'd look at that setting and you'd be confused. Right now, my scenes are set to lock. I'll set them to unlock real quick. Well, I'll set them to lock first, in case anybody wasn't here earlier and needs a quick rundown of that. So, by default, the way that the M01D works is it'll start playing from the beginning and keep playing until the end, and it won't loop. So, you can't loop an entire song on the KORG M01D without going around and touching these patterns manually. Okay, so you notice that it plays each pattern in sequence by default, and the M01D's behavior will have it go all the way to the end of what's available, and it'll stop once it gets there. Just like we had on the upper screen in the DSN-12, we have a selection of information that tells you where you are in the song. So that is pattern 7 on step 13. It'll tell you how many steps you have available to you in each pattern. Or rather, in a specific pattern in this case, there's 64 steps available in every pattern in the song. This right here is the number of voices that are sounding at once. Remember I said earlier that the M1D is polyphonic rather than monophonic, meaning that it can play individual sounds on top of one another, but there is a limit to the amount of sounds that it'll play at once without cutting them off. You can keep your eye on the voice count to see that happening. On the M1D, you can hear up to 21 sounds, or up to 24, I believe, at the same time before it starts cutting things off. With the sounds you have available to you, you probably are not going to hit that limit. It is a nice expansion from the 12 available voices in the M1 cart version that was only available in Japan. We also have our swing counter, which I'm not going to get into right now. This right here is our tempo. This is our song title. And this up here is information about the track that we're dealing with. So right now this is saying I'm on track 2. I'm in the 01W sound bank under polysynths, and the synth name is Fresh Air. We'll see that a little more when we go into choosing instruments. And this here is the memory free. Because the M1D allows you to just freely stack as much music as you want, there's no set count for the number of patterns available to you. It instead goes by the amount of memory that's free. In contrast, the DSN-12 has a hard limit of 4 banks of 16 patterns. The M1D can technically make as many as 99 patterns, but that's very long and it would take a very long time to play through depending on your tempo. While we're talking about the limits of the M1D, it can only go up to a tempo of, I believe, 360. It won't go any faster than that, which is generally fine, but the reason we'd be messing with tempo and the individual step counts on a per pattern basis in this program is because we can't have steps closer to each other than one step. We'll get to that in a moment. Okay, so now we're going to go on to the Chaos Pad and see what it does in this app. They have all these little differences because the apps are really aimed at different kinds of composition. The M1D, like I mentioned before, is a sampler. It is good for composition, and the differences between it gear it towards that purpose. So in the M1D, you're focusing on making the music. You're not focusing on making the sound. You have the sound already available to you. So some of the things that are relevant to the DSN-12 are not relevant to the M1D. Like all these subtle differences between the apps gear it towards certain purposes. And that's why I say that one, these apps complement each other, and two, they're for different things. So if we go into the Chaos Pad, we have the same command bar up here, but what the buttons do is different. So let's see what these do. Right now, our Chaos Pad is still set to X is pitch, and Y is gating. So let's talk about this first button. This first button is how many notes will sound at the same time when you're working with the Chaos Pad. It's set to mono, so it'll behave like the DSN-12. So only one note plays at a time, and its gating and its pitch are determined by what you are dragging around. We can set it to chord 2, so that means we have two notes layered on top of one another at the same time. We'll go into that a little further in a bit. We can set it to 3 chord, so now there are 3 notes layered on top of one another. We can even go as high as 4, but that's as high as we can go, because it starts to become a little unwieldy after that, because you can only see 1 octave at a time when you're in the piano roll. We'll go into that in a moment. So this button over here just solos what you're working on. Just like in the DSN-12, we can individually play whichever track we're working on, just so we can concentrate on what we're doing. Now, K-set is your Chaos Pad settings, and it is exactly the same as the settings in the first bank of the Chaos Pad in the DSN-12. We have the key that we want to adhere to, the scale we want to adhere to, and the number of octaves we want to vary what we do with. So let's take a look at variation first to discuss that. Just like in the DSN-12, we can tell this Chaos Pad to make the difference between the right and the left end of the Chaos Pad farther apart on the piano. So if you select towards the negative end, that means that you will go lower on the piano roll when you are dragging back and forth. And likewise, if you go to the plus end, you'll go higher. So if you want your Chaos Pad to be D sharp, minor blues, and you want to be able to go as high as 4 octaves above where you are, you do that by setting it here. And let's hear what that sounds like. Now, another thing I want to note, these buttons up here always stay the same. So if you want to get back to that main screen from anywhere, you just press this main button. No matter where else you were, you can get right back to the main screen. That's just so you don't get confused and can navigate the program well. So let's go back to our Chaos Pad and go into our K settings. So it retained the settings we set. Let's hear what that sounds like. We press yes to confirm and drag around on the Chaos Pad to hear what we've got. So This end is lower, and this end is 4 octaves higher. We can change those settings at any time, and that will just affect what happens when we play around with this Chaos Pad. In order to record what you do, you need to press record and then press play. And you drag on top of it. If you don't press play, it's not going to record anything. So keep that in mind. And you can go right back to the sequencer by pressing this last button, the sequence button. And that'll just get you to the notes that you were writing. Just like in the KORG DS-10 or DS-12 or DSN-12 rather, you can audition the notes by touching the notes on the piano roll, and you can see what notes you've written and navigate with the circle pad. However, that's where the similarities end. You'll notice that this piano roll is a slightly bit clearer than the DSN-12's piano roll, which is another reason why I always recommend it to people that are inexperienced with this, just because visually it's a little easier to deal with. So just like we had before, this first button in our command bar is our selection modes. So we can toggle between selection, copy, erase, draw, and go right back to selection. And you cycle through those to get whichever one of them you want. If we select individual notes, we can see down here our note settings. Right now, that first note that we have selected is 1 step long, and its velocity is 12. Now let's go over velocity real quick. Velocity is roughly analogous to volume, but there's a little more nuance to it than that. When you imagine velocity when it comes to music, I want you to imagine resonator bells or a xylophone or a drum. Imagine hitting a drum with a drumstick. If you hit a drum softly with a drumstick, it'll sound very low in volume, but it'll also sound less intense. So let's take a listen to this instrument. So it's low volume and there's not a whole lot to it. If I select this particular note and increase the velocity, you're not really going to hear much of a difference with this particular instrument. But with an instrument that is like a drum or a mallet or something, you get different performance when you change the volume. So let's listen to this drum. Let's go into our mixer real quick and make sure we only have the drums soloed. And let's listen to it real quick. So right now, there is no velocity change on any of these. They are all at the velocity of 12. So you might not have been able to hear that. It may have been subtle, but it changes the way the note is performed. We can actually just make a new file to listen to that. So I'll return to that in a moment. So beyond the Chaos Pad, we can jump to a keyboard where you can audition different notes right away. So let's say I go to the first track and then I go to the keyboard. I can't hear anything right now because I have a track soloed. But luckily, from anything that you need to edit sound with, you can change whether or not an instrument is soloed. So let's add it to the solo. And we can hear the different notes. You can also record, so you can play a little song on this piano if that's how you feel comfortable inputting notes. It's good for instant feedback if you're a beginner, just to be able to hear what different notes sound like and get used to it. You can go right back to your sequencer by pressing tone. Or rather, you go to the instrument settings. So while we're here, let's take a look at the instruments. We have these different banks of instruments. Well, these are categories of instruments. We have categories of instruments here. And these three buttons are our banks. So we have three different sound banks to deal with in each instrument category. Let's go to our keyboard real quick and take a look at our banks. So we have the M1 bank, which is the entire bank of sounds that came with the original M1 music workstation that this app is built after. The M1 was a keyboard music workstation back in the 80s, I believe, and they called it a music workstation because it was one of the earliest keyboards that didn't require any extra equipment for you to make entire sets of music. You could just use that keyboard and arrange things into songs and just play your songs right from the same machine. That is the same basic idea behind this app. It's fully featured for making music start to end. You don't need any extra equipment to make your music. Now, as I'll be teaching in my tutorials later, you will need equipment to get the music off of the 3DS, because the 3DS doesn't have any hardware that allows you to do that by default. But with a good audio interface and just a wire, you can record pretty easily. So that's the M1 bank. We have these different instruments available, and we can press this button right here for audition. That's how we hear what each instrument sounds like. Now we can't hear anything here because we have left an instrument muted. So we can't go and solo an instrument from here. We're going to have to go to main and then mix. We only have this one track soloed, so let's get rid of that and go right back to what we were doing by pressing main and pressing the name of the instrument we want to deal with. So now we're back in this tone menu, and we're in the M1 bank on synth 3 right now, and that is reflected up here. Track 1, M1 bank, keyboard category. The keyboard we have selected is called ePiano 3. We can press this audition button to hear what that sounds like. So that's a quick way to hear the different sounds as you're choosing your instrument. Now remember from the DSN-12 how we messed with the ADSR envelope? That is attack, decay, sustain, and release. Well, and the M01D, since it's not a synthesizer and is instead a sampler, we don't deal with decay or sustain. We just have attack and release. So attack is how long it takes from Attack is how long it takes to get to the maximum volume after you've started using a note. So once you've hit the note, how long does it take to get to the maximum volume that note's going to be? And release is how long it takes to go from that maximum volume down to nothing. So we hear that. It starts up instantly, ends instantly. If we press down on this attack value here and drag to the right, it increases that number. Drag to the left decreases that number. You can also use the D-pad. Pressing right to left changes which of these items you're selecting, but pressing up and down changes the value. So if we have the value set to 8 or 9, let's audition it and see what that sounds like. It fades in, and it still instantly goes out because our release is set to 0. So let's listen to it with no attack and no release. And now let's turn the release up. Long after I let go, it's continuing to fade out. And while you can't edit the sounds in the M01D, you can use attack and release in clever ways. And with a good understanding of how audio works, you can even fake new instruments just by combining tracks. Now, the thing is, you sacrifice a track in order to do so, but that's up to your discretion. You as the composer need to figure out what kind of sound you're after and use the sounds available to you as a palette to make new sounds. As you can hear, the instruments in the M01D are very high quality because they're samples. They're recordings, and you don't have any control over what they start off as. You just edit what's there in very limited ways. The focus is really more on composition in this app. So if you play a song that's written in this app from start to finish, in order to loop it, I'd have to wait till it gets to this and then press the first one. Remember the setting we had set before for scene lock? If we had that unset, it would switch between these patterns instantly. And that's something to keep in mind if you ever want to be a live performer with this app. Other than that, you have a mixer to deal with, and each of these values are whether the effects are on or off. Unlike the DSN-12, you only have one effect available at a time, and you just toggle whether or not you want to apply it to each track. And down here is your panning settings, because you can't change the pan of each individual note. You can only change panning of individual tracks. So if you want something to pan, you have to make that decision in advance. And in this case, you'd be thinking of it more like positioning instruments on an orchestra than making sweeping kind of motions or anything. You can still improvise little tricks and figure out how you can maneuver within the constraints of the program, but that's the hard limit there. So we're going to take a quick look at the two effects you have available to you. If there are no more questions, that's basically the end of the stream for now. I'll do another one tomorrow and probably another one after that, but there isn't much left to teach in terms of interface until the full videos are available. So I'll give it a few more minutes just to compensate for the delay. Hey, anytime. Thanks for coming. I think that'll be all for today. Good luck with the apps. I'll be doing more of these going forward. I'm doing these every day until the sale ends, and then after that, I'm going to be continuing to pledge for more of it. Yeah, you made it all the way. Thanks.